For decades, Tim Allen made America laugh. He played the dependable dad, the clumsy handyman, the confident voice of childhood heroes. From sitcom living rooms to animated galaxies, his presence felt warm, familiar, safe. But behind that smile was a man carrying a resentment so deep that by his own admission, it poisoned much of his life. And now, at 70, Tim Allen is no longer hiding who that hatred was really aimed at. The loss that never healed. Long before fame, before laughter paid the bills, Tim Allen was just Timothy Dick, a boy growing up in Denver as the third of 6 children in a noisy, ordinary household. His father, Gerald, worked in real estate. His mother, Martha, was active in community service. Their home was not glamorous, but it was stable, filled with siblings, routine, and a sense of direction. That stability vanished in an instant in 1964, when Tim was 11 years old and his father was killed in a car accident. The loss was sudden and absolute. There was no preparation, no closure, no slow goodbye. One day his father was there, the next day he was gone, and the emotional center of the household collapsed. Tim later described this moment as the first time the world felt unsafe. His mother, grieving herself, was forced into survival mode, raising 6 children alone while carrying her own unresolved pain. The family grew closer in some ways, but the silence inside the house grew heavier. Laughter still existed, but it no longer felt anchored. 2 years later, another change reshaped Tim's inner world. His mother remarried, introducing a stepfather named William into the family. For Tim, still frozen in grief, this felt less like healing and more like replacement. William's parenting style was strict, disciplined, and emotionally distant. To a boy who had lost his father without warning, the new authority figure did not feel like protection. It felt like intrusion. Resentment began quietly. It lived in small moments, rules enforced without warmth, expectations without emotional safety, authority without intimacy. Tim did not have the language to describe what he felt, only the instinct to resist it. The more structure his stepfather imposed, the more Tim pushed back. What began as unresolved grief slowly hardened into anger, directed not only at the man in front of him, but at the life he felt had been taken away. This resentment did not fade with time. It settled. And without realizing it, Tim Allen began building his identity around avoidance, rebellion, and eventually self-destruction, patterns that would follow him long after he left his childhood home. Rebellion, addiction, and the need to escape. By the time Tim Allen reached his teenage years, the anger he never learned to process had found an outlet. The loss of his father and the daily friction with his stepfather created a constant internal pressure, and Tim responded the only way he knew how, by pushing back. School became a battleground rather than a refuge. Authority figures were no longer guides, they were obstacles. Rules were something to test, not respect. Drugs and alcohol entered his life not as rebellion for rebellion's sake, but as escape. They dulled the sadness he didn't know how to name and gave him temporary control over emotions that otherwise overwhelmed him. What started casually escalated quickly. The more his home life felt restrictive, the further he drifted toward behavior that guaranteed conflict. His relationship with his mother grew strained, caught between loyalty to her new marriage and fear for her son's direction. Despite the chaos, Tim did not abandon ambition. He enrolled at Central Michigan University, later transferring to Western Michigan University. It was there in the early 70s that something unexpected happened. Tim discovered comedy, not as entertainment, but as release. On stage, he could reshape pain into laughter. He could talk about family, frustration, masculinity, and disappointment without sounding broken. Humor gave him control. The audience listened. They responded. Stand-up became his language. His style was grounded, observational, and personal. He talked about everyday struggles, family tension, and male insecurity, wrapping discomfort in punchlines. The crowd laughed, but for Tim, something deeper was happening. Comedy allowed him to externalize what he could not confront directly. It became both shield and weapon, a way to survive emotionally while avoiding deeper healing. As his confidence grew on stage, his off-stage life grew more reckless. The late 70s comedy scene was fast, chaotic, and saturated with substance abuse. Tim fit in too well. In 1978, everything collapsed. He was arrested for possession of more than 650 grams of cocaine. At the time, he was building momentum in comedy, but suddenly he was facing a possible life sentence. The decision he made next would define him forever. To avoid decades behind bars, Tim cooperated with authorities and testified against others involved. The sentence was reduced to 3 to 7 years. He served just over 2. Prison stripped away illusions quickly. There was no audience, no applause, no laughter to hide behind. Fame as a distraction, not a cure. When Tim Allen walked out of prison in the early 80s, he did not step into redemption. He stepped into reinvention. Los Angeles offered anonymity, opportunity, and distance from everything he had been forced to confront behind bars. He committed himself to sobriety and to comedy with the same intensity that once fueled his self-destruction. On the surface, it looked like progress. Internally, it was avoidance refined into discipline. He began performing regularly at the Comedy Store, quickly establishing himself as a reliable presence. His material was sharp, grounded, and unmistakably masculine. He joked about tools, relationships, frustration, and the absurdities of modern life. Audiences saw confidence. What they did not see was how carefully constructed that confidence was. Comedy had become his armor. If he kept people laughing, they wouldn't look too closely. Television appearances followed, stand-up specials, industry attention. By the early 90s, Tim Allen was no longer rebuilding, he was breaking through. The role that changed everything arrived when he was cast as Tim Taylor on a family sitcom centered around home improvement, marriage, and fatherhood. The irony was immediate and profound. A man still wrestling with unresolved anger toward a father figure was now playing one every week. The show became a phenomenon. Tim Taylor was clumsy but well-meaning, emotionally guarded but present. He made mistakes, learned lessons, and always came back to his family by the end of the episode. Viewers connected instantly. The character embodied a version of masculinity that felt safe, humorous, and familiar. For millions of families, he became part of their weekly routine. For Tim Allen, the success was overwhelming. Fame arrived fast, along with money, security, and validation. On paper, he had won. Yet privately, the same resentment lingered. Playing a father did not resolve his own unresolved childhood. In many ways, it intensified it. Every scripted lesson about communication and emotional growth highlighted what he had never fully processed himself. The longer the show ran, the deeper the contradiction became. He was praised for portraying warmth while feeling emotionally distant from his own past. He was applauded for stability while still carrying unresolved rage. Awards and ratings reinforced the illusion that success equaled healing. It didn't. Outside the sitcom, Tim's career expanded rapidly. Film roles followed. Voice work introduced him to a younger audience. He became a household name. But the pattern remained consistent. Work filled the space where reflection should have been. Achievement replaced introspection. The voice that traveled farther than the pain. By the mid-90s, Tim Allen's career had reached a level few actors ever experience. Television had made him familiar, but animation made him timeless. When he was cast as the voice of Buzz Lightyear, it did more than expand his resume. It reshaped how an entire generation heard him. Buzz was confident, authoritative, heroic, and deeply certain of his purpose. He spoke with clarity and conviction. He believed in himself without hesitation. That certainty was something Tim Allen had never fully known. The success of the animated film was immediate and overwhelming. Children adored the character. Parents trusted the voice. Suddenly, Tim Allen wasn't just the sitcom dad. He was the sound of bravery, loyalty, and reassurance. The irony was sharp. Behind the microphone was a man who still carried doubt, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. But voice acting required no visible vulnerability. It allowed him to perform strength without revealing weakness. At the same time, his live-action roles continued reinforcing a specific image. He became known for portraying men navigating masculinity in a changing world, men uncomfortable with vulnerability, using humor to maintain control. Films that followed leaned into that identity, balancing family warmth with emotional restraint. Audiences laughed, but the pattern was unmistakable. Tim Allen kept playing men who never fully said what they felt. One exception briefly cracked the surface. In a dramatic role later in his career, he portrayed a man confronting aging, relevance, and dignity. It was quieter, heavier, and more introspective than his usual work. Critics noted the restraint in his performance, the sadness beneath the dialogue. For those paying attention, it was a glimpse of the emotional depth he rarely allowed himself to show publicly. Outside of film and television, his voice became synonymous with comfort and nostalgia. He narrated campaigns, celebrating home, tradition, and belonging. His tone was steady, reassuring, rooted. It resonated deeply, especially in places that valued familiarity over change. Once again, Tim Allen became a symbol of stability, even as he privately wrestled with unresolved instability. As he aged, his on-screen persona shifted toward overt ideology. In a later sitcom, he played a man openly resistant to cultural change, clinging to tradition while surrounded by a world that no longer reflected his values. The character felt personal, not performative. The lines between role and reality blurred. He wasn't just playing a conservative father. He was articulating a worldview shaped by decades of emotional defense. The show's cancellation and subsequent revival became part of a larger conversation about identity, belonging, and cultural division. For Tim, it was another reminder that his public image had become inseparable from a version of masculinity built on resistance rather than reconciliation. Fatherhood, forgiveness, and the confession he couldn't avoid. As Tim Allen grew older, the roles that once distracted him began to mirror him too closely to ignore. Fatherhood, once a fictional framework on television, became a real responsibility with real consequences. He had daughters now. He was the man shaping someone else's childhood. And slowly, the question he had avoided for decades began pressing in from all sides. What kind of father had he become? And why had he spent so much of his life angry while pretending to be fine? His personal life had gone through fractures and repairs. His first marriage ended, but it did not collapse into bitterness. He remained present for his daughter, determined not to repeat the absence that had defined his own childhood. Years later, he built a second family, welcoming another daughter and recommitting himself to stability. On the outside, it looked like maturity. Inside, it was reckoning. Tim began speaking more openly in interviews, not with jokes, but with restraint. He admitted something that startled longtime fans. Despite success, despite money, despite admiration, there were long stretches where he genuinely hated his life, not because of fame and not because of work, but because the anger he carried had never been resolved. It had simply been buried under achievement. The resentment he once aimed outward had turned inward. He realized that much of it was never truly about the man who became his stepfather. It was about loss, about timing, about a boy who never got to say goodbye. The strictness he had rebelled against was no longer the core issue. What remained was grief that had been frozen in place for decades. Forgiveness did not arrive as a dramatic moment. It came quietly, through reflection and age. Tim acknowledged that his stepfather, flawed and rigid, had stepped into an impossible role under impossible circumstances. He recognized that holding on to hatred had not protected him. It had imprisoned him. The realization was uncomfortable, but necessary. Comedy, once his shield, began to change. His humor softened. It became less defensive, more reflective. He spoke about pain without turning it into a punchline. He allowed silence into conversations where laughter once rushed in to fill the space. This was not reinvention for an audience. It was reconciliation for himself. What remains when the laughter stops? By the time Tim Allen reached 70, the noise that once surrounded him had softened. The frantic climb, the constant proving, the need to stay relevant, all of it had slowed. What remained was quieter, and therefore harder to avoid. Without the constant distraction of production schedules and premieres, Tim was left with the thing he had spent a lifetime running from: himself. He had spent decades building a public identity around reliability, the dependable dad, the confident man, the voice that reassured millions. But privately, that identity had often felt like a performance layered over unresolved pain. The anger that once fueled rebellion had long since turned into exhaustion. And exhaustion, more than anger, was what finally forced him to speak honestly. In later interviews, Tim did not dramatize his confession. He didn't frame it as scandal or shock. He simply said the truth. There were long stretches of his life where he hated being alive, not because he lacked success, but because he never felt at peace. Fame had amplified everything except healing. The more he achieved, the clearer it became that achievement alone could not repair childhood wounds. Looking back, Tim began to understand how much of his career had been shaped by avoidance. Comedy helped him survive. It gave him control. It gave him distance. But it also delayed confrontation. The roles he chose, the characters he embodied, even the world view he projected, all of it was built around strength without vulnerability. Only later did he realize how heavy that armor had become. Today, his life looks quieter. He works less frantically. He speaks more carefully. He values presence over applause. He remains sober, grounded, and committed to family in ways that feel less performative and more intentional. The anger has not vanished completely, but it no longer controls him. It has been named. And naming it changed everything. Tim Allen spent decades making others laugh while quietly struggling with himself. Do you think success can ever truly heal old wounds? Or does it sometimes just hide them longer? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that go beyond the spotlight.